Okay, I think we'll, we've got about 62, I see the count is continuing to go up here, so we'll get off to a gentle start, and we'll assume people will likely join us in progress, but we will get moving along here to honor all of you who've been able to join us already. So welcome to our Canadian Shared Security Operations Center webinar. And I want to thank all of you as participants for making time for us on this Friday afternoon. And also, I do want to just make note and a sincere thanks to our Canary partners for providing us with the environment that we're using today for this Zoom webinar. Thank you to Canary for that. This is the first of 3 Zoom webinars that we're going to be providing for our community. We hope to keep people informed as we move forward with our proof of concept. This is just our first webinar today, and it's an introduction webinar, so you'll see that we've also got some tentative timelines and topics for the other agendas, or the other webinars that we're going to be providing to you, and you can see the agenda for today. So I'm going to ask my colleagues who are joining in on the call today to introduce themselves now.
Hi, this is Isaac Straley. I am the Chief Information Security Officer for the University of Toronto, and I'm also the Acting Director of the CanSSOC project.
And I'm Wandschneider. I'm the CIO at the University of Toronto and a member of the steering committee for CanSSOC.
Great, thank you both, Bo and Isaac. So our format today, as you can see, we're in a Zoom environment, and I just want to point your attention to the bottom of your screen. We are going to be taking questions. We will ask people to provide their questions in the Q&A box that you can see at the bottom. If you click on that, you'll be able to see questions as they come in. We're going to attempt to keep questions to the end, but if we see things that look like they need to be answered in context, we'll take that opportunity as well. You can post them in there, and then some of them I can certainly answer as we move along. Otherwise, we will take them at the end and let everybody hear what the questions are as well as the answers. And I'll work on facilitating that as we move to the end. I think that's it for housekeeping. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to kick us off.
Sure, thanks, Gayleen. So this is Bo Wandschneider from the University of Toronto. So I'm going to start by trying to outline a little bit of the challenge that we're facing in higher ed and some of the justification for why we're looking at this project. So we're seeing a huge increase in criminal activity on the internet, and I think it's safe to say this poses challenges for us, both in terms of the sheer volume of some of these unsophisticated threats, as well as the complexity of very sophisticated threats that are funded and supported by organized crime. So that's getting a lot more attention, and a lot more of what we see in the world is well funded and well resourced. In addition to that, we're also seeing cybercrime propagated by nation states, both in terms of generating revenue to fund their activities, as well as capturing IP from our institutions and state secrets from across the country. It's this IP that, along with the open nature of our networks, that I think poses some unique and interesting challenges for higher education. In addition to universities, say the size of University of Toronto or Alberta or UBC, in addition, the universities the size of Toronto or Alberta generate an enormous amount of events and logs. And current pricing models for private sector solutions simply don't scale, or don't seem to scale very well when we talk to them about that. So that's another one of the challenges that we have to face. So as a result, I'd say the scope of the activities towards prevention, detection, and mitigation at all levels, both institutionally and at the national level, continue to increase in both complexity and costs. So if we want to look at hardening the sector, this increase in complexity and costs can only be addressed through a sector-wide, nationally supported approach. And I think that's what we're going to be talking about today. So if we can flip to the next slide, and talk a little bit about the opportunity that we see through the shared SOC. So if we need a sector-wide, nationally supported approach that not only provides support to our sector through access to common and shared services, but also includes incentives to support, and in some cases requires collaboration and information sharing across our sector, as well as, where appropriate, other sectors. And so this is the notion of linking into some of the resources that the Government of Canada has. There are a number of things that we can deliver through a shared SOC, and I'm going to highlight a few of them here. and maybe we can drill into those as we go through this. We've had lots of discussions around this, and we certainly feel that together or collectively we can see a lot more of what's happening to our environments if we work together. And this is where machine learning and AI really comes in. If we combine the event data across the sector, there's likely going to be patterns and threats that we can't see if we were to stay as individual institutions looking only at our own data. And this is kind of interesting and kind of exciting, and something that we're seeing in the private sector, but across other verticals than higher ed. So that's one thing that we think Shared SOC can deliver on. The other thing is the challenge that we face around talent attraction and retention. So we're all struggling with finding people to work in this area. There's not enough of them, and they're very expensive. And so we're having trouble finding them, and then we're losing them to private sector corporations. So we generally feel that it's going to be easier for us to do that in the collective. We're certainly introducing a really interesting greenfield opportunity, and we're also sharing costs. So I think that's an important approach here. So to find this really high-end talent, it's a lot easier if we can share costs. So there's some sort of efficiencies there. So the third thing is economies of scale. This is pretty straightforward. If we all work together, we can begin to eliminate duplication and probably garner efficiencies. The fourth thing that we could find out of this is that we can really move this towards this higher ed focus. And this is what I talked about earlier on in the last slide, where I'm not convinced yet that the private sector understands our vertical and understands the nature of our network in terms of the volume of traffic that we generate, but also the openness of our networks. Certainly when I've talked to individuals in the private sector, there are things that they're asking us to give them just don't exist in higher ed because our networks are so open and we have so much activity happening. I also think that the research IP makes us a little bit different, right? So there certainly are other sectors that have the IP that we generate, but combined with the other things, I think there's some uniqueness in this vertical. And then the final thing that I just want to say around the opportunity is this notion of creating a global profile. And I really do believe that to tackle some of these things, especially since we're talking about organized crime coming from countries all over the world, and we're talking about nation states, we have to think beyond our national borders. And I think there's an opportunity here for Canada and the Canadian higher ed sector to take a leadership role and produce something a little bit different and unique. So if we switch to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the partnership. So what we listed here is the 6 Canadian universities, so the University of British Columbia, Alberta, McMaster, McGill University, Ryerson, and the University of Toronto. And we're working in partnership with the National Research and Education Network. So Gayleen already mentioned Canary, who's helping facilitate this for us, but also working with the provincial NRENs like Sabera, Orion, RISC, and BCNet. So those are the provincial ones associated with the 6 universities that you see in the left-hand column. Question comes up frequently when I talk to people is, why is it these 6 universities? And it's a very good question, and it's one that we're trying to articulate. I'd say this has come out of a lot of different discussions that we've had across the country over the last few years. The notion of creating a shared SOC has been discussed in a number of different communities, and in some places it's moved forward quite a bit. In other areas it hasn't moved forward so much. But last year there was a meeting of the U15. I'm going to call them the chief business officers. So your chief administrative officers, or whatever you call them at your institution. They had a gathering here in Toronto, and they had a presentation from Brad Wheeler, the CIO at Indiana. Brad is a very colorful speaker and can certainly sell a point. And I think it was a bit of an eye-opener for some of the people in the room. I think they were kind of shocked and stunned with the complexity of the issue and the severity of the issue facing us. And when he gave that presentation, he described a collaboration that was forming around some of the Big 10 universities in the US. So if you watch any of the sports in the US, you'll know that the Big 10 is a conference that's very active in sports. but they do a lot of things collaboratively amongst those big 10 institutions. And they were putting something together called OmniSOC to meet that challenge. So after that meeting, there was some discussions, and we started looking for schools who had financial and people resources able to commit to a proof of concept. We also wanted to focus on schools who had a large amount of research IP, because we thought this was one of the challenges that we were facing in terms of trying to protect that, especially when you start thinking about the attacks coming from nation states. So out of that, we had these 6 institutions. These 6 institutions are essentially just providing some leadership to try to get this going through a proof of concept. They all made a financial commitment of $250,000 for the project, and staff availability as well. The intention is to build a framework for a solution that is national in scope. At the same time that we brought those 6 institutions together, we also felt that it was really important to include our partners who ran the research and educational networks within the respective provinces. They were doing some very interesting things. They were having discussions with us on the side before this, and they oversee the networks that a lot of our traffic travels across. Not all of our traffic, but a big chunk of it. Canary also had done some work with the universities on the JSP, which is the Joint Security Project, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. And they had also been in discussions with ISED, talking about how, given the activity of nation states, this was really a national issue. In a sense, we'd always protected our borders at the national level through land, sea, and air, and cyber really just is emerging as a 4th front and really has to be thought of from the national perspective. And I think when you look at it that way, I think that speaks volumes to the magnitude of the problem that we're facing. We've had lots of interest expressed to join the POC, and this is why we're having this webinar today, and we've got 2 more coming up, at least 2 more coming up before the end of the project. When we talked to people about joining the POC, we pushed back a little bit and sort of said, well, we wanted to manage the scope of the proof of concept, right? Too many partners around the table would make it very challenging. We wanted to be agile, get something done in a fairly short time period, which was targeted around 18 months and finishing sort of at the end of December. And as I said earlier, it's loosely modeled after the OmniSOC project at the Big 10. And when they started that out, they really only invited 2 or 3 institutions out of the Big 10. They talked to all 10 of them, brought 2 or 3 to the table, began working through some of the initial proof of concept, getting some of the legal agreements in place, which are challenging and something that we've started working on here and gotten in place, at least for the proof of concept. But they wanted to keep it small and manageable, and they're adding 1 or 2 institutions every few months now, and bringing it up to speed. Now they're starting to talk to institutions beyond the Big 10. I think it's also important to note that early on we had discussions with them about what they were doing, and one of the conversations that I had one day was with a former CIO from Canada who's working in one of the Big 10 universities was, well, can we come and join that? And it was just too difficult to work across the international boundaries at the basic level of what a shared SOC is. But we're certainly building strong partnerships, and I think probably Isaac or myself will talk about that in the next little while. So the next slide we're going to talk about is the outcomes. What we're trying to do here is get a model or a framework on developing a national shared SOC. So it's not so much about the 6 institutions, 6 universities are there, or the partners in the NRAN. It's beyond that, and it's really looking at this at a national level. It's designed to do this in a collaborative way between institutions, so everybody's got some skin in the game, and it is making a contribution in some way. At the end of the day, although things aren't predetermined, right? Part of the proof of concept is to figure out where we could go. But we could imagine that the shared SOC is going to have a suite of services, and those suite of services can be delivered sort of in an a la carte fashion to schools. Every school is going to be different. Every school is resourced differently at different levels of maturity, and they're going to want to, I think, consume services from the SOC in a different way. Certainly, if you look at large schools and small schools, that's probably where the biggest divide is in terms of having capacity even to interact with something like CanSSOC. And just hold that thought for a while, and when we talk about some of the other projects, I might highlight a little bit about that. So that sort of outlines the outcomes, and what I want to do now is turn it over to Isaac to talk a little bit about outcomes and deliverables, some more specific things.
Thanks, Bo. Yeah, so this is Isaac Straley, and so as we looked at this project, it became clear that we are aiming high, but it took some time to stand up some of the pieces. And when you've got even just sort of the 6 universities that we started with, we've got a lot of challenges in making sure that we can, actually build out a process and a system that works well together. This included standing up the team as we're starting to figure out what are those first pieces that we build out. Where do we get our early wins? What are the things that we can do to understand what the future could really hold with this in a meaningful way? And how do we get the institutions to share data, right? So this is also not just an idea, it's something where we actually have different institutions in different provinces that need to share information. So I actually want to highlight on here, so this is one of the timelines we're going to look at. On the bottom left-hand side, you can see sort of a light list of some of the accomplishments, or a high-level list of some of the accomplishments. And the data transfer agreement was a pretty big one. It took some time to talk to each of the institutions, especially because the security folks and the IT folks and the CIOs came to the table, but we had to get the rest of the institutions on board. This is not just an IT initiative. And so we spent some time standing up the project and also getting these data transfer agreements and the other agreements we needed to do to actually be able to facilitate the transfer of information. So that's where we're at now, is we stood up the project, got the agreements in place, and are now working through each of these areas. And so you can see, in terms of data transfer, we started actually looking at really doing it in June here. In July now, we're working through these processes. We're going to come back to you in September to sort of talk to you about how it's going. In October, we've got a deliverable around that, which I'll break down a little bit more. Then as we sort of mature that, we'll come back in November and see how we're going and really see what the next steps are. And our goal is to have some amount of operations started next year. But as we're looking at this, as we also spent this time building up, we also started looking at the other models out there. So as Bo mentioned, we started with OmniSOC as a foundation, but there are many different types of stripes. There's a fundamental question is, what is a SOC? And from my perspective, I don't think I'm ready to answer that yet. And I think that's part of what we're doing here, sort of seeing what are the services that really make sense, especially early on, what makes sense to have something across the board, and then how do we build in the a la carte services that are meaningful to folks in a way. Some of the areas that we've looked at are not just sort of incident handling management, but is there a place for threat hunting? Is there a place for actually providing active response with systems? Are there, sort of elevated, like enhancing existing teams, looking for things like the advanced persistent threats or some of the other nation state activities, or where is that sweet spot, especially to start early on? And we took some time looking at the different models. We took some time getting the agreements in place. And now we're actually working through setting something up. So I want to walk you through at a high level, so 3 major milestones we have for the proof of concept. So again, big aspirations here, but we want to start in a way that gives us something that's a clear and easy win to show that this can work from the collaboration point of view and to show that it delivers the value that we're talking about. And then we can start adding on things to this. So October is that first milestone I talked about. And we're going to talk to you before this because we want to take you along in the journey. But what we're looking at doing is having all 6 of the sites sending logs in a way that we can have some amount of dependability on. We picked, to simplify this, we picked 5 use cases. Actually, we're still picking the 5 use cases, but we're working through 5 use cases to say what are the things that we actually want to show that we can alert on, that we can detect, that we can get the logs for, because it's easy to say collect the logs and start looking at things, but we know that different institutions have access to different logs. And so we take the use cases, and in security operations jargon, this is just the outcome that we want. What do we want to find? What do we want to happen when we find it? And how important is it that we find it? So we're taking these use cases and seeing what institutions can send, how they can send it, and then can we get this analysis going? Another big piece of this is the threat intelligence, and we're actually really excited about this part, especially as an early win. So looking at the information that's out, both available in the world and through partner institutions like government institutions, other higher education groups, OmniSOC, there's some security operation groups as well that operate at different levels. Can we connect with them, start pulling in threat intelligence in a meaningful way? We do see the future of this as being able to have some amount of our own analysis. This is where we see the machine learning and AI coming into scope, but it may take some time to build those things out. And so what we want to do is, there's already known threat intelligence. Can we align that with our use cases, get some amount of learning out, and then work with institutions to figure out how we want to manage them? Because this is another thing that we'll be continuing to talk about is what does incident management really look like? You know, are there going to be a high volume of alerts that require local staff to do certain things, and how do we close them out? Are we going to do a smaller volume of alerts, really target it, and have some real consistent and strong analysts have eyes on it? So we're picking the latter right now. Let's keep it small and tight, but we're going to still be exploring through our use cases what this looks like. Once we get to October, we'll have all these things operational. We'll have the use cases working. We'll sort of know where we're at. And this is where we can start to mature it. So as Bo mentioned, the project is charted to run through December. So from October to December, we're going to be looking at especially the threat intelligence. How can we turn this into something that really provides an easy win for more institutions without having to go through some of the additional onboarding pieces? And can we do something like that? So can we share threat intelligence both for institutions that want to manage and massage their own, and for those who just say, just give me something that's useful, like a curated blacklist or block list for edge devices. We're going to be looking through that time to start refining the operations and certainly delivering the actual charter deliverables as part of this. So in terms of the proof of concept, we're looking at really producing the recommendations from it. But to do that, we have to start standing up operations. We'll also start to, in addition to the sites, start looking at the relationships with the NRENs and see how we can look at what they're doing, how this fits in. And Bo and I will talk about that in just a moment a little bit more. And then 5 use cases is nice, but they're simple, they're high level. So how can we start to mature that use case process? And I think there'll be an opportunity for some community conversation around this one. But we want this to work. And so having deliverables in December before we know sort of what the next steps are presents a real challenge to operations. So we're actually looking at right now, right now we're running through April is the plan, knowing that we're going to have some decisions there. So while we get to December, we've produced the deliverables, we're going to continue with the operations provided they're working in the way that we like what we're seeing. This is where we're going to work on figuring out the funding, turn this from a proof of concept to something operational, start looking at adding some of the SOC staff and exploring other different staffing options. And this is where you'll start to see the next layer of services coming out of this. And this is where we'll start to explore the a la carte services. So is it, examples of things we're looking at under the threat hunting umbrella is doing some vulnerability scanning connected with the threat intelligence, doing some phishing, honeypots, the more robust analysis through machine learning, looking at SIM integrations, things like that. So it's not defined yet. We'll have a better definition of that when we get into that November timeframe, but this is the high level plan here.
Okay, so thanks, Isaac. And there are some interesting questions that are coming up on the Q&A, so I encourage you to go in there. Gayleen is either answering or asking people to hold on, so I'll just direct Isaac to maybe look at a couple of the questions that have come up there that we will answer after we're done a couple more slides. So in terms of what's happening out there in the space, I'm going to say there's a whole bunch of things that are happening. These are, in my mind, complementary projects happening across the community. The first thing I'm going to start with is talking about the Cuccio security benchmarking project that's being led out of Ryerson by their CIO, Brian Lesser. I think this is really interesting. I think we're up to 40-something universities that are being monitored by BitSight. We can sit and debate the merits of this tool, But at the end of the day, the interesting piece here is we can benchmark over time against ourselves and against other institutions, and that has significant value. In addition to that benchmarking project, we're very shortly going to be issuing a survey that was developed out of JISC in the UK, and the institutions are going to answer a bunch of questions from that survey, and it's going to give us a good sense of what this looks like across the country, and that has a lot of value. Isaac, can you just mute yourself, if that's okay? The other project that's gone on, or is going on, is the Joint Security Project. So this is something Canary issued probably 2.5 years ago now, where we began collecting information from different institutions. Collectors were set up at different sites. Information flowed through to 3 universities. I think it was McMaster, Waterloo, and possibly Concordia. I'm not sure if I have that last one right. And from my perspective, so this is my perspective, this was the early days of giving the government some sense of the order of magnitude of the problem. That's the way I looked at this. By collecting this information, we could now have a conversation with the government and give them some sense of what was happening. I think this also came out of the breach that happened at the NRC, when they were very concerned about the IP at the NRC, and they began asking, well, what's happening at the universities? You've got a lot of IP out there. What does it look like? And I think this went a long way to helping answer that question. I think this is going through a second round of funding, it sounds like, and we're going to be collecting some more information. I know that there is an individual at the University of Waterloo who's been analyzing the information and using very similar tools to what we're doing here in the shared SOC, and we're having some discussions with them now about sharing that knowledge, which is exactly what this project is about, is sharing knowledge across the country. The other interesting projects that are happening are around the NRAN SIM project, so security incident and event management systems that they're setting up. So there's national level funding. They're coordinating on that to stand up the same technology across those regional networks. I think this is very interesting. It's very exciting. It's very complementary to what we're doing with CanSSOC. I'm very much looking forward to consuming some of the information that comes out of here and seeing how and if we can integrate that with CanSSOC and add some value to it. So again, another complementary project. I can drill down a little bit into this one here called OnCheck, which comes out of Orion in Ontario. It started out early days as a shared CISO project. So 5 universities and 3 colleges got together with Orion and hired a CISO. Some of the institutions certainly couldn't afford to hire a CISO on their own, so this was a real bonus for them. But there was also this notion of sharing knowledge, information, best practices across those institutions through the shared CISO. That's now evolved into something called OnCheck, where I think they're up to 20-something participants across the province. I don't have the latest numbers. They've got different levels of service that they're offering, from very light services around assessments that we can use collectively and benchmark against other institutions, into much more in-depth services. I see this as playing a very important role in the future to linking to something like CanSSOC. So the small institutions that don't have the resources or the staff on their end to link into CanSSOC will be able to do that through a program like OnCheck. But again, as we've said all along, this is all evolving. And I think it's important that the way I look at this is we're all learning, we're moving forward, we're heading towards some target, but we don't know what that target is yet because it isn't defined yet. This is something so new and so evolving that the end result, I don't think, really exists. So we're just getting to a higher platform that's going to allow us to take that last leap to whatever it is we need to do sort of at that national level. On the international front, we've alluded to some of these already. Lots is happening. So in the US, there's the OmniSOC. It continues to grow, continues to evolve, getting really engaged with them, and they're excited and interested in some of the work we're doing. And we're hoping we can begin to share some of this threat stuff across the border. In addition, in the US, there's some interesting work happening in California at the UC system. We're talking to them, and there's some stuff happening in Texas from the university. I believe it's the University of Texas, but it's across that sector as well as the government sector, and we've been in discussions with them. Going further afield, the regional networks, or the NREN equivalents in Australia is ARNet, although I probably said that incorrectly, and some of the people from the NREN are going to correct me afterwards. But they're looking at a national initiative. We've been talking to them. They've been talking to OmniSOC, and they're moving forward. And as well in the UK, JISC is working on some things, and we want to keep those connections together. And that comes back to that global piece that I said, that it's important for us to think about this nationally, because I think we will be collaborating with these organizations over time. So I'm going to pass it on to Gayleen to sort of wrap up, and then we can go to questions.
That's great. Thanks to both Isaac and Bo for all of the information they've shared so far. So we are really interested in ensuring that people are able to continue to stay informed. And we have a CanSSOC website where we have been posting information. We're just going to flip over to that so we can give you an example of what that looks like and where you can find that. That's the CanSSOC.ca. And that website has, here we go, a number of presentations that we've already given. As we provide presentations, we're posting them here. So this presentation today, we already had one question from someone wondering if we could share that. We are very happy to do that. We'll post the webinar presentation up on this site. So this, you can see all of the communications we've been doing. It is really important for us that we're continuing to keep the community as a whole informed about this proof of concept as we move along. And now we'll flip over just to the main homepage, and thanks to Isaac who's doing all the navigating there. And maybe what we can do, and then this is the homepage here. So you can see that there's a few different areas that you can explore when you come to CanSSOC.ca. And now I'm going to suggest that we move over to our questions, and I'm going to we have a couple that came in while Isaac and Bo were speaking, so I'm just going to go back and review some of those. We're going to flip ourselves into view. Hugh Burley actually has a question that's up right now, so maybe while his question is still outstanding, I can ask either Bo or Isaac to take that, and then we can flip over to some of the questions we've already answered just to reflect on those before we open up for some of the other questions. So either Bo or Isaac, if you'd like to respond to Hugh, please.
Sure, I can jump in. Thanks, Hugh. I guess my quick response to you is patience, patience. I think probably Isaac could elaborate a little bit more on this, but I would think that that would probably be in that January to April timeframe that we might look at that. The first thing we want to do is see what the Shared SIM project is doing and try to ingest some of that information, and then I think we would move to this. Is that fair, Isaac?
Yeah, and I think the early opportunity is the threat intelligence, and so it doesn't get you all the wins you might want from sharing that information. So the question Hugh has is, some of the smaller institutions have the ability to share data now. How might we engage, or they engage with CanSSOC, and what time frame might we be considering in that? And so I think that looking through December, there might be some early opportunities with the threat intelligence, and we're still defining exactly what that is. But certainly after that, we'd be looking for an opportunity to get more institutions on if it's working. And so it would be in that, at least in that April timeframe.
Great. So maybe what I can do, I know there's a couple more quick questions that came up, but perhaps we can go back. And just a reminder to everybody, the Q&A box is at the bottom of your screen, and you're more than welcome to pop in your questions there, as some of our viewers have already done. There's a couple of questions, though, that did come in earlier, and I just want to go back, and thanks also for reminding us to read the question, which is also helpful. Somebody did ask what Isaac's role is, and we introduced at the beginning, but I know that not everybody popped in then. So Isaac is the CISO at the University of Toronto and also acting director for the CanSSOC Proof of Concept. We're really lucky to have him on board with us. So that's one question. The question that I'm going to pass back to you, Isaac, is from Dave Mayo. He wanted to know what SIM was chosen and where is the Security Operations Center located. I was able to answer that, and I'm going to leave it to you to talk about the SIM if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, I'll just make sure that the rest of it is answered too for everybody else in case they can't see it. So currently the CanSSOC is actually located at the University of Toronto. That's something we're going to continue to explore is the location that makes sense, but we're here right now. And then the sim that was chosen, it's actually a challenging answer. So we're using ELK as part of it. So early on, as part of our proof of concept, we're sticking around an open source mandate. We're going to be exploring other areas and other technologies, and I think we've got some questions about that we can dig into that concept. But so we're using ELK right now, but it's not being positioned right now because of the use of an analysis engine. It's not being positioned quite as a sim. But one of the challenges with ELK, if you've ever used it, is it doesn't scale great. And so we're actually looking at enhancing ELK with something called Metron as well. And that piece definitely gets out of sort of the traditional sim place. That's how we're going to start looking at doing high volume and high level analysis, and also looking down the road to plug in machine learning and AI. There's some other components too, but essentially ELK plus Metron, I think, is the core answer you're looking for.
That's great, thank you. The next question, maybe you can go ahead and read this one from Curtis Isaac, if you're able to see it, and then obviously go ahead and respond too. Thank you.
Yeah, so the question is, there seems to be a significant overlap with some of the big vendors like Cisco who provide tools like this. An example for Cisco is Umbrella, AMP, ThreatGrid, etc. Where much of this is done live in the environment. Is there any interest in partnering with institutions like this? And I think the easy answer is yes, but we want to get, our hands around what we can do, especially with open source technologies and shared technologies. The other piece, though, is that, like Bo said early on, we're concerned that there's not a match for all the higher education and higher ed situations. So while we'll explore some of these technologies, a lot of them are already being used in institutions. And so if we can aggregate some of that information, instead get trained sort of eyes on glass or people looking at the analysis, I think we can create a better hybrid model, leveraging investments people have already made as well too. And then we can look at the global SOC if it makes sense and where it makes sense to partner in that way.
Perfect. Okay, and we've already answered Hugh's question, so thank you. And you repeated that. So we'll go back over to the open questions now. There's a number of them there. And I'm going to leave it to you, Bo and or Isaac, if there's one or two of these that you want to pick up and respond to, both reading the question as well as providing the answer, please.
So Alex, do you want to start maybe with Alex's question on partnering with cloud providers and how we're currently doing that or not doing that?
Yeah, sure. So we're starting on-prem largely just to keep it controlled. And part of it is, especially when we're working across provinces, the cloud issue and data sovereignty is an issue, and so we want to make sure we've appropriately worked through those. And some of it is also just building up that skill set and knowledge as well too. My personal take is I see cloud partnership as an important part about this. If we need to grow, scale, and be flexible, that to me is a part of it, but I don't want to make that presumption. We want to actually test it out. So we're working on site to build things out, seeing how they scale, seeing what the cost looks like, and then we're starting to look at where we can do some testing in cloud services, but we want to do it light to start so we make sure we get it right.
That's great, thank you. Okay. The next question was from Rob Millman. Question is, was there any discussion about compliance requirements like PCI and the service provider aspect of sharing a SOC?
Also a very good question. We haven't gone down that road yet. So there definitely needs to be, as it gets operational, we need to treat the SOC like a service provider, whether you're doing it in the PCI context or not. So anybody who uses it, even though it may not be a managed service, that's one of the discussions is how much of a managed service is it versus some other entity, but either way it's going to be a service provider. So we'll need to, as we go through this, produce documentation to show the security and assurance that we have, and we'll need to do it in a way that aligns with regulatory compliance. We still, because we don't have firm answers of the exact services a SOC will provide, I can't say right now where it fits with PCI, but the long-term goal needs to be in a way that it's positioned in a way that it can help the people who need that.
Okay, that's great. Now, if you don't mind, we've got somebody who did use the chat to ask a question, so I'm just going to move that one in queue and remind everybody that we're going to follow the Q&A box down below if that's possible for everyone. The question that came up was from Anna, and I got to go back here and see if I can find it here. I think she wanted to understand how the SOC would be staffed. Sounds like the idea is that everyone uses the same SIM, and SOC is based on monitoring SIM alerts. Is that correct?
It sounds like there's two questions in there. So on the SIM question, the answer is probably no. So we've built the SIM on, or at least the SIM technology that we're using on our end, but there has to be an amount of flexibility and adaptability for institutions. When we were doing this exploration, the OmniSOC model is the institutions bring their own entirely. That works for some of us, but not for all of us. One of the other US higher education operation centers we looked at, they rolled entirely their own stack. That provides a lot of easy wins because you can deploy that, it's consistent, it's sort of easier to manage, but I don't think it addresses the complexity that we have. So on the everybody uses the same SIM, I don't think that's where we want to go. It is something we're obviously exploring, but it doesn't seem to match our objectives. On the staffing side, I didn't get a clear sense of the question, but I do want to say that we are looking at providing some amount of SOC analysts who can actually supplement, right? Is this going to be sort of a tier 1 operation? I don't know, not early on, but certainly an amount of shared services so that you can have analysts who are experienced with this, especially the more advanced threats. That seems to be the early win for sure. But we also want to explore a way in which we can have sort of shared operations out of there. So right now we've got people here, and we're actually working with a couple of the institutions as partners to have some remote staff, and we're working on sort of what the virtual staffing situation might look like. And I think there's more questions than answers there right now, but we definitely want to be able to provide, especially for the recruiting efforts we talked about and the talent recruitment efforts, we want to be able to provide those services to those people.
Yeah, maybe I could just elaborate on that. I think that whole notion of virtualizing the staff is a really appealing concept and part of the partnership approach to this. There's benefits from the recruitment and retention side, right? So imagine if we have the right person sitting out on the west coast of the province, and why do we move them to the center of, the west coast of the country, and why do we move them to the center of the country if they could work remotely? And if we want to follow the sun sort of approach, where we want to have longer availability if we got to move to 24/7, eyes on glass, or whatever it is that we're going to, I think there's a whole bunch of opportunities by partnering across a country so large as Canada.
Yeah, and I think just the example of both the steering committee as well as the technical advisory committee and even our communications group, we're all working very remotely on this project right now. So it's already, that's part of the proof of concept. How can we coordinate and work across geographic locations? Okay, we've got still a couple of open questions. Either of you want to take either of these?
I think one of the questions is I'm going to go to the bottom one here. Todd Williams, D&D have joint security ops centers where connected analysts from multiple jurisdictions are physically co-located so they can verbally and organically communicate. And so I think that's actually, I think we just addressed that one.
Okay, that's perfect. And then the next question from Travis, we're using ELK internally for logging and aggregation, and curious what you are using to add intelligence and analysis to ELK to make a full-fledged SIM.
So we're doing a couple of things. So first is the threat intelligence work. So in terms of technology, we're actually using MISP, that's M-I-S-P, and we're exploring a combination, combining that with something called MineMeld, M-I-N-E-M-E-L-D. The second is an open source project from Palo Alto. The first is an open source threat intelligence sharing platform. So for part of it for ELK is making sure that we get really strong threat intelligence. That's a really important part of it, especially if we're not using commercial rule sets and some of those commercial engagement pieces. And we think for higher education, this is a really big win because while there are threats that are sort of universal to the world, there are some things that are they're very particular to higher education, especially when you consider that you might have multiple universities involved in attack, I like to call them low and slow. And so by being able to collect the threat intelligence that's already out there and enrich the data with it, that's a big early win, but it's kind of also a simplistic view. So I also mentioned Metron is another tool we're using. It's M-E-T-R-O-N, Metron. It's a fork and growth out. Actually, I shouldn't say it's a fork. It was originally OpenSOC and became an Apache project. There's lots of components under Metron because, in fact, it uses some big data components and Hadoop, which has its own stack. So there's a lot of pieces to that stack that I couldn't easily break down right now. But that's what we're looking at in terms of the analysis side.
Okay, great, Isaac. That's the end of the questions that we've received so far. I'm just going to check our chat just in case anything's in there. Oh, and we've got another question that's just come up. Go ahead, Isaac, if you like.
Yeah, so the question is what are you expecting for bandwidth and volume of traffic? And I mean, a lot. we don't have those numbers yet. That's one of the things we're doing through October is we've done some surveying to get what we think is the sense of it. But if you've ever worked in any sort of logging project, you know that the reality, you don't get the reality until you just turn it on. And a lot of it's going to depend on which logs we're collecting for what use cases. So one of the challenges is also where you take the logs from. Do you take them from network logs at the perimeter before or after whatever edge devices you have? Do you take authentication logs? Do you have one set of authentication logs or 40 applications with different set of application logs? What do you do for user authentication? What the volume is on that? So what I can tell you more is the analysis we're doing to get there, but we don't have numbers yet that we can at least settle on, even for the SECs.
All right, and it looks like the next question from Kyle is also a good one for you to answer, Isaac, if you could.
Yeah, so the question is, will this include vulnerability scanning of the different organizations? If so, what open source tools will you be using? So that's in our roadmap. It's not defined yet, so we're doing some initial exploration right now. We'll really start to flesh it out from October through December, and we'll have a better sense of it by the beginning of the year, what it's going to look like. We're looking at OpenVAS right now, which is a Nessus fork. And some additional pieces as well too. That's what we're starting with. This is one of those areas where there may be an opportunity for commercial partnership down the road. We don't know what's going to work, what's not going to work. So we're going to start with the open source tool set and see what we can do. But we need something more than just an individual scanner. So we picked OpenVAS because it's got more of the enterprise is not the right word and console is not the right word, but it's got more of the advanced features that we might want to do to be able to do this at scale. But we've got some questions there because in addition to the scanner itself, we need to also be connecting it to some sort of incident management tool. There's a couple open source ones if you're interested in this. So there's something called the Hive project. This is different than the big data, the Hive, which is a commercial project or commercial software. But the Hive project, and it's basically all one word, is one of the tools we're looking at for incident management. So in addition to the scanner itself, we need to figure out how to be collecting these data in a way that makes sense, that gets it to you in some meaningful way. Another challenge in that space is also asset management. So once we start doing scanning, we have to be able to say, what is it and how important is it? This is part of the advanced analysis we want out of the threat intelligence and alerting as well too, but we're working through that.
All right, you're on a roll, so keep on going. Do you want me to read the questions to you, or are you okay to read them? Is it easier for you if I read them to you?
Either way.
Okay.
I'll just keep reading it. So the next one is, will you be using protocol analysis tools like Zeek to feed data into ELK? And this is another one where I think the answer is yes, but I don't know who we is just yet. So there's certainly some Zeek efforts happening through the JSP and other areas, so we're going to be investigating that. It's a great tool set that institutions can and should be using for themselves if they've got the bandwidth for it. So we expect some institutions to bring that. University of Toronto has a Zeek deployment, and so we've got an easy in and taking a look at that. It might also be something that ends up in the sensor or logging stack. So right now, in terms of how we get the logs, we're looking at deploying log collectors at each of the sites using part of the Metron stack, which is called NiFi. Maybe this is part of the earlier question too in terms of the ELK. Using NiFi and some other tools to collect that information. But it makes sense to actually deploy more of a sensor-like format too. So it's not definitive that we will adopt Zeek and deploy it or get institutions in there, but certainly Zeek is an important part of the open source stack. And if you haven't looked at it yet, I highly recommend you take a look at it. You may also know it previously as Bro IDS, but they changed the name of it.
That's great. So I can take the next question from Dave. Thanks, Dave. Dave says, seems like a great initiative. I look forward to hearing how this progresses. What's the best way to keep tabs on the status of the initiative for those not in the POC? Perfect question. We are posting everything, updates as well as presentations, including this presentation on our CanSSOC website, Dave, and that's at cansoc.ca. And so we will continue to keep the community aware. We do have some more webinars coming, and I'll get to that when we do our close, just in terms of some timelines there. But definitely the website is the right place to go. And at any time, you're welcome to reach out to us as well. There is an email address on our website too. Okay. Bo, do you want to take this one from Paul?
Yeah, sure.
Answer if you don't mind reading the question first.
Yeah, so the question is, will you share the MOU and transfer agreement with institutions so we can see how this would work for us? I think that's a great question. So I think Isaac alluded to this earlier. When we went and talked to OmniSOC, and certainly when we went, some of us went down and did a visit with them last summer, the biggest challenge they had, they said, was actually MOU. And that was really interesting because, as I said, they're the Big Ten, and they do work together and they work collectively, and they have all sorts of sharing agreements. And even with that, it was a big challenge to do. So what we've got now with the MOU and transfer agreement is for the proof of concept. And I'd say that means it's a little bit lighter than what we're going to have in place for when we go to a production environment or operationalize this. So one of the things that we're working on is figuring out how do we tie up some of the loose ends. But let me take this to the steering committee, and we'll have a discussion on if we can share this out to sort of give you an early sense of what it looks like. But as I said, I think it's very light compared to what it'll need to be when we fully flesh out what it is the services are going to be. Is that fair?
I think so. Yep.
Okay. Great.
That's good. Do we have any additional questions so we're about just over 5 minutes away, so we certainly have time for more questions if anybody else has one. I'm just doing a little scope through our chat just in case any questions have ended up there. I think we're okay. That's great. So maybe while we're just finishing up, I can mention again that this is the first of 3 webinars, maybe more, but certainly we have 2 more that we're planning on delivering to the community in the fall. So we're looking at probably late September, I think we tentatively said, and then maybe in November as well. So lots of great questions about some of the technology and the activity that the technical team are undertaking. So our plan at the next webinar would be to bring the technical folks in, so they'll be able to listen in, and you can hear a little bit more about what's going on behind the scenes for those of you who are interested in that. And an additional comment that's just come in, thanks Jason, was to keep the Cuccio security special interest group engaged as a good way of keeping them up to date as well, and I agree with that. I think that's great. We appreciate that, and we're happy to share. We really are trying to get as much information as we can out to the community at large, all of those who are interested. And again, we certainly encourage you to be proactive if you have questions, but also check out the website. And once again, we'll be posting this webinar as well as any other materials up there for you to have a look through. So there's actually quite a bit of information about where we've communicated already, in addition to some of the presentations we've given, but we'll continue to use our communication channels to keep you all informed. Okay, so we are nearing the end, and I don't know if there's anybody else who has anything else that you want to ask. Bo or Isaac, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap up with everybody today?
Thanks for the questions. They were awesome. They're really, really good. Really great.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you for your participation and your interest in this. We're really excited about it. We're really excited about bringing you along for the ride and sharing more information as we go. It's taken some time to get here, but now that we're in a place where we can really talk about it, we just want to keep this conversation going. So thank you for your interest.
Yeah, and thanks for the offers to help and assist, and we will be reaching out to you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Super. Okay, everybody. Thanks for taking time on a Friday and for sharing your afternoon for a weekend with us. We're wishing you a good summer. And again, stay in tune on the website, cansoc.ca. Oh, how will we, sorry, one more question. Rena's asking, how will we know the dates for the next meeting? We haven't set those firmly yet. We will use the same channels that we used this time to keep people informed as to when, and we'll give you advance notice. We also have an event calendar on our website, and we'll be posting things into that calendar. So, and putting bulletins up there just to keep people aware as well. So definitely, again, we're very interested in having participants. I think at a high number today, we had 130, approximately 129 people participating. So that's a great turnout for us to get the word out. So if you tell a friend and so on, we'll continue to keep more and more people informed of what's going on. Thanks, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you all soon. Bye-bye.